December 1st, 1943. The air above the German border trembled with a sound no Luftwaffe pilot had ever heard in such numbers. It was not the familiar drone of the lumbering American bombers they had hunted for months, nor the whine of the shorter-range thunderbolts they had learned to evade by simply climbing higher and waiting. This sound was different. Sharper, closer, more persistent. At 28,000 feet, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler tightened his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon beyond his Messerschmitt's canopy. The winter sun glinted off something metallic in the distance, something that should not have been there, not this deep into German airspace. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies over the Reich. Their fighters rose, intercepted the Allied bombers, and returned home before the escort fighters ran out of fuel and turned back toward England. It was a rhythm, a deadly waltz that German pilots had mastered. But on this frozen December morning, that rhythm shattered. The metallic glint resolved into a formation. Then another, then dozens more, sleek silver aircraft with squared wingtips and bubble canopies that seemed to see everything. They bore the white star of America on their wings, and they were not turning back. Stigler's radio crackled. A voice, tense and disbelieving, cut through the static. "Sie kommen weiter. They keep coming." The words would echo across every Luftwaffe frequency that day, a phrase that marked not just a tactical surprise, but the beginning of the end of German air superiority. The Americans had arrived with an aircraft that could reach Berlin and back, and the long silver fighters bearing the name Mustang would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare in a way no German ace had imagined possible. To understand the shock that reverberated through the Luftwaffe that December day, one must first understand what the German fighter pilots expected. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had settled into a brutal but predictable pattern. The American 8th Air Force launched daylight bombing raids deep into German territory, targeting factories, refineries, and rail yards with their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. These bombers flew in massive formations, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, their defensive firepower formidable, but their speed agonizingly slow. German fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, would scramble to intercept these raids. The Luftwaffe pilots were experienced, many of them aces with dozens of kills painted beneath their cockpits. They had developed tactics specifically designed to crack open the American bomber boxes, head-on attacks to demoralize bombardiers, coordinated strikes from multiple angles, even air-to-air rocket attacks from beyond the range of the bombers' 50-caliber machine guns. But the true advantage the Germans possessed was not in firepower or even skill. It was in range. American escort fighters, primarily the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, could only accompany the bombers to the German border before their fuel tanks forced them to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers flew alone, and the Luftwaffe hunted them mercilessly. German pilots called this area the Free Zone, where American blood fell like rain and the skies belonged to the Reich. In October 1943 alone, the Americans lost 60 bombers in a single raid on Schweinfurt, nearly 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. The loss rate was unsustainable. American commanders knew that without long-range escort, the daylight bombing campaign would fail. The Germans knew it too. They believed that the Americans faced an impossible choice: abandon daylight precision bombing or continue to sacrifice their crews in numbers that no democracy could stomach for long. The Luftwaffe expected time to be their ally. They expected the mathematics of attrition to favor them. They expected the Americans to break before the Reich did. What they did not expect was the Mustang. The North American P-51 Mustang did not begin its life as a world-changing weapon. In fact, it nearly ended its career in obscurity. Designed in 1940 at the request of the British Royal Air Force, the P-51 was created in just 117 days, a rushed response to Britain's desperate need for fighters. Early versions, powered by American Allison engines, performed well at low altitudes but struggled above 15,000 feet, precisely where the bomber war was being fought. The British used these early Mustangs for reconnaissance and ground attack, but not for high-altitude combat. The aircraft seemed destined to be a footnote. Then came an experiment that changed everything. British engineers, searching for ways to improve the Mustang's high-altitude performance, replaced the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. The transformation was extraordinary. The Merlin-powered Mustang became faster than the FW-190, more maneuverable than the Bf-109, and crucially, capable of flying farther than any fighter in the world. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of nearly 1,400 miles. American factories began producing Mustangs in staggering numbers. By the autumn of 1943, the first P-51 Billions and P-51C models arrived in England, assigned to fighter groups of the 8th Air Force. Pilots transitioning from Thunderbolts and Lightnings marveled at the Mustang's handling. It was lighter, faster, more responsive. The bubble canopy provided visibility that earlier fighters could only dream of. And most importantly, it had the range to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. But range alone does not win air superiority. The Mustang would have to prove itself against the best fighter pilots in the world, men who had been killing. Allied aircraft since 1939, men who flew daily and knew every trick of aerial combat. The Luftwaffe aces did not fear new American aircraft. They had faced Thunderbolts and Lightnings and learned to counter them. They assumed the Mustang would be the same, another Allied fighter that would perform well near the coast but lack the endurance to challenge them deep in the Reich. That assumption would cost them dearly. The sound of the Merlin engine became the symbol of this transformation, a roar that German pilots would come to dread. Unlike the radial engine of the P-47, which produced a deep, rumbling growl, or the twin booms of the P-38 with its distinctive Allison engines, the Mustang's Merlin sang at a higher pitch, a mechanical scream that carried across the winter skies. It was a sound of precision engineering, of British craftsmanship, married to American industrial capacity, and it announced the arrival of an aircraft that simply refused to leave. German pilots noticed the sound first. On early encounters, they would engage the Mustangs as they had engaged previous escorts, climbing to altitude and waiting for the Americans to reach their fuel limits. But the Mustangs did not turn back. They stayed. Mile after mile, deeper into Germany, the Silver Fighters remained locked to the bomber formations like protective wolves. When Luftwaffe fighters attacked, the Mustangs dove to intercept. When the Germans tried to climb away, the Mustangs followed, their Merlin engines propelling them upward with an ease that stunned pilots accustomed to outclimbing Allied escorts. And when the battle ended and German fighters broke off to refuel, the Mustangs were still there, circling, waiting, guarding their bombers all the way to the target and all the way back to the channel. The sound of those Merlin engines, persistent and unyielding, became an auditory symbol of American industrial might. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts, its factories bombed, its fuel supplies dwindling, its production struggling to replace losses. America, by contrast, was producing aircraft at a rate that defied comprehension. In 1944 alone, American factories would build more than 15,000 Mustangs. The sound of the Merlin was not just an engine. It was the sound of a nation that could afford to fill the skies with fighters, that could train new pilots faster than they could be killed, that could sustain losses and return the next day with even more aircraft. For German pilots, listening to that high-pitched scream growing closer, it was the sound of inevitability. Franz Stigler, the pilot who heard those first radio calls in December 1943, was not a novice. He had flown combat missions since 1940, fought over France, Britain, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. He had 28 confirmed kills, making him an ace several times over. He knew the feel of his Bf-109 like a man knows his own heartbeat. He understood energy management, deflection shooting, tactical positioning. He had survived 4 years of war by being better, faster, and smarter than his opponents. But on that December morning, as the Mustangs closed in, Stigler felt something he had not experienced in years: uncertainty. The American fighters moved differently. They did not lumber like the Thunderbolts, and they did not fly in the rigid formations that made previous escorts predictable. The Mustangs flowed through the air, their pilots clearly confident in the aircraft's capabilities. Stigler selected a target, rolled into an attack, and squeezed the trigger. His cannon shells arced toward a Mustang that was diving to engage another Bf-109. But the American pilot saw him, a luxury afforded by that enormous bubble canopy, and broke hard. The Mustang turned inside Stigler's turning circle, a maneuver that should have been impossible for an aircraft with such long range. Long-range fighters were supposed to be heavy, sluggish, trading agility for endurance. The Mustang defied that logic. Stigler pulled up, trying to use his altitude advantage, but the Mustang followed. The Merlin engine's supercharger kept the fighter fast and nimble even at high altitude. Stigler's radio filled with similar reports, pilots calling out Mustangs on their tails, pilots reporting that the Americans were not turning back, pilots asking for fuel status and realizing that the escorts had more endurance than the German defenders. And through it all, that repeated phrase, "they keep coming." The transformation in German perception did not happen instantly, but it was irreversible. In the weeks following those first encounters, Luftwaffe intelligence officers debriefed returning pilots and compiled reports. The conclusions were grim. The P-51 Mustang was faster than German fighters at all altitudes. It could outclimb them above 20,000 feet. It could outturn the FW-190 and match the Bf-109 in maneuverability while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers to any target in Germany. And most devastating of all, the Americans had hundreds of them, with more arriving every week. German pilots who had once looked forward to engaging American escorts now faced a dilemma. Attacking the bombers meant exposing themselves to the Mustangs. Engaging the Mustangs meant burning fuel in combat with an aircraft that could afford to fight longer, and ignoring the raids entirely meant allowing American bombs to fall unopposed on German cities and factories. There was no good option. The Luftwaffe's ACE system began to collapse under the weight of this new reality. German fighter pilots flew multiple sorties per day, often without adequate rest, because there were never enough pilots to cover every raid. They faced opponents who were increasingly well-trained, flying superior aircraft, and supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The aces who had terrorized Allied bombers in 1942 and 1943 began to fall. Some were killed in combat. Others were so badly wounded they could no longer fly. A few, like Adolf Galland, were reassigned to staff positions. Their expertise needed more in planning than in the cockpit. The Mustang did not just defeat the Luftwaffe tactically, it defeated the German philosophy of aerial combat, which relied on individual skill and superior tactics to overcome numerical disadvantages. Against the Mustang, flown by competent pilots in overwhelming numbers, skill alone was not enough. The historical evidence of this transformation is preserved in combat reports, kill ratios, and the desperate evolution of Luftwaffe tactics. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force recorded its first month of positive kill ratios, destroying more German fighters than it lost in bombers. By March, Mustang-equipped fighter groups were regularly engaging and defeating Luftwaffe formations that outnumbered them. The 357th Fighter Group, flying P-51s, became the top-scoring group in the European theater, with over 600 confirmed air-to-air kills. The 4th Fighter Group, transitioning from P-47s to P-51s, produced multiple aces who credited the Mustang's range and performance with their success. German records tell the same story from the opposite perspective. Luftwaffe sortie rates declined even as the threat increased. Pilot training programs were shortened to rush new flyers into combat, resulting in inexperienced pilots facing veteran Americans in superior aircraft. Fuel shortages, caused in part by Allied bombing that the Luftwaffe could no longer prevent, meant that even when German fighters could scramble, they often lacked the fuel for extended engagements. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote that the arrival of long-range American escorts marked the point at which Germany lost control of its own airspace. The numbers bear this out. In 1943, before the widespread deployment of the Mustang, the 8th Air Force lost 1,003 bombers. In 1944, with Mustangs escorting most raids, losses dropped to 2,777 bombers despite flying more than 3 times as many sorties. The Mustang had not eliminated losses, but it had made deep penetration raids survivable. For the Luftwaffe, the opposite was true. In 1944, Germany lost approximately 25,000 fighter pilots, killed, wounded, or captured. The force that had begun the war as the most experienced air force in the world was being bled to death by attrition it could not sustain. The emotional weight of this shift was captured in the writings and interviews of German pilots who survived the war. Günter Rall, third highest-scoring ace in history with 275 victories, described the arrival of the Mustang as the moment the Luftwaffe knew it would lose the air war. Johannes Steinhoff, another high-scoring ace, wrote that fighting the Mustangs felt like being hunted, a reversal of the predator-prey relationship German pilots had enjoyed for years. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the famed Star of Africa, had been killed before the Mustang's arrival, but his tactics of energy management and precision gunnery became obsolete in an environment where American fighters could sustain energy and numbers indefinitely. Perhaps most telling are the accounts of younger German pilots, men who entered combat in 1944 and faced the Mustang without the cushion of experience that earlier aces possessed. These pilots described a sense of hopelessness, of flying against an enemy that could not be defeated because defeating one Mustang meant nothing when 10 more appeared the next day. They spoke of the sound of the Merlin engine as a harbinger of death, a mechanical scream that followed them through dives and climbs and turns, relentless and inescapable. One pilot, whose name was recorded only as Lieutenant H in a post-war interview, described his first encounter with Mustangs over Berlin in March 1944. He had been in combat for 6 weeks, had 2 kills to his credit, and flew a brand new Bf-109G6, one of the latest models. He intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds and prepared to make a head-on attack when 4 Mustangs dropped out of the sun. He broke left, and they followed. He dove, and they stayed with him. He climbed, burning fuel desperately, and they climbed faster. When he finally escaped by fleeing east at full throttle, his fuel was nearly exhausted, his ammunition was gone, and he had not fired a single shot at the bombers. He landed, was immediately ordered to refuel and take off again, and spent the afternoon watching his wingman die in a turning fight with a Mustang that simply would not let go. He survived the war, but he never forgot the feeling of powerlessness, of knowing that the aircraft, chasing him, was better in every measurable way. The symbolism of the Mustang's Merlin engine extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. That sound, heard by millions of Europeans in occupied territories, carried a message that transcended aerial combat. It was the sound of American power, yes, but also of American commitment. Every Mustang that appeared over Germany represented a staggering investment of resources: the aluminum, mined and smelted in the United States, the factory workers who built the airframe in California or Texas, the Rolls-Royce technicians in Britain who assembled the Merlin engines, the ships that carried the aircraft across the Atlantic, the ground crews who maintained them in England, the fuel refined and transported to keep them flying, and the pilots trained at immense expense in schools across America. The Luftwaffe could shoot down a Mustang, and did, thousands of times. But every loss was replaced, often within days. The sound of the Merlin was the sound of an industrial and logistical machine that Germany could not match and could not stop. It was also the sound of a different kind of warfare, one rooted in democratic principles rather than authoritarian efficiency. German aircraft production prioritized quality over quantity, with skilled craftsmen producing smaller numbers of highly capable aircraft. The Focke-Wulf TA-152, introduced late in the war, was arguably superior to the Mustang in certain performance metrics, but Germany produced fewer than 200 of them. America, by contrast, embraced mass production, standardizing the Mustang design to allow rapid construction by semi-skilled workers in multiple factories. The result was an aircraft that was good enough, produced in numbers that overwhelmed any qualitative advantage the Germans possessed. This was industrial democracy in action, not the brilliance of individual genius, but the collective output of a free society marshaling its resources toward a common goal. The Merlin engine, that high-pitched scream echoing across the Reich, was the sound of that philosophy made manifest. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. The Normandy invasion on June 6 relied on complete Allied air superiority, and the Luftwaffe was unable to contest it. On D-Day, Allied aircraft flew more than 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300. The Mustangs that had fought for control of German skies were now providing close air support to ground forces flying low-level missions against trains, convoys, and retreating Wehrmacht units. German pilots who managed to take off faced not just Mustangs but Thunderbolts, Spitfires, Typhoons, and Lightnings, all operating with impunity because the Luftwaffe's ability to organize effective resistance had been shattered. The transformation was complete. The force that had terrorized Europe in 1939 and 1940, that had brought Britain to the edge of defeat, that had swept through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with arrogant ease, was now reduced to scattered, desperate defenses. The Mustang had not achieved this alone. The combined efforts of Allied bombers, tactical aircraft, intelligence, and ground forces all contributed. But the Mustang was the instrument that made it possible. By escorting bombers to targets deep in the Reich, it forced Germany to defend everywhere and succeed nowhere. By establishing air superiority over the continent, it allowed the Allied ground invasion to proceed without fear of aerial counterattack. And by grinding down the Luftwaffe's pilot corps through sustained attrition, it ensured that Germany could not rebuild its aerial defenses even when it managed to produce new aircraft. The epilogue of the Mustang story extends beyond the immediate tactical victories. In the years following the war, captured German pilots and commanders were interviewed extensively about their experiences. A common theme emerged in their testimonies. The Mustang represented not just a superior weapon, but a superior system. German aces had been trained in a philosophy that emphasized individual prowess. The top aces accumulated hundreds of kills, while less skilled pilots contributed little. This created a fragile structure where the loss of a few key individuals could cripple entire units. The Americans, by contrast, trained pilots to a consistent standard, ensuring that even average pilots could be effective. When an American ace was killed, his squadron continued to function because the system did not rely on heroes. This philosophical difference, embodied in the mass production and deployment of the Mustang, revealed a deeper truth about the nature of industrial warfare. Authoritarian systems, for all their talk of strength and will, ultimately depended on resources they could not sustain. Democratic systems, often dismissed as weak or indecisive, could mobilize entire populations and economies in ways that dictatorships could not match. The Mustang was a product of this democratic mobilization, an aircraft designed by engineers free to innovate, built by workers who saw themselves as part of a collective effort, and flown by pilots who believed in the cause they were fighting for. The sound of the Merlin engine, echoing across Europe, was the sound of that belief made audible. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of Mustangs remained in service. Many were scrapped or sold to other nations. Some were converted for racing, their speed and handling making them favorites on the airshow circuit. A few remain flying today, carefully maintained by collectors and aviation museums, their Merlin engines still producing that distinctive high-pitched scream. Those who hear them at airshows often remark on the sound, a mechanical song from another era. But for those who heard it in 1944, over the skies of Germany, the sound carried a different meaning. For Allied bomber crews, it was the sound of salvation, of escorts that stayed with them through hell and brought them home. For German pilots, it was the sound of inevitability, of an enemy that could not be stopped because it could not be exhausted. And for the people of occupied Europe, looking up at contrails scratched across the blue sky, it was the sound of hope, of a force powerful enough to challenge tyranny and prevail. The phrase "they keep coming," transmitted across Luftwaffe radio frequencies in December 1943, was more than a tactical observation. It was an admission, an acknowledgement that the rules had changed, that the advantage had shifted, and that the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The German aces who spoke those words were not cowards or incompetents. They were skilled professionals who understood aerial combat better than almost anyone alive. But they also understood mathematics, logistics, and attrition. They could see the silver Mustangs filling the sky and calculate what it meant. They kept coming, and they would keep coming, because behind them stood a nation that could produce fighters faster than they could be destroyed, train pilots faster than they could be killed, and sustain a war effort that Germany, for all its early brilliance, could never match. The Mustang was the instrument of that truth, and the sound of its Merlin engine was the anthem of Allied victory, a mechanical roar that proclaimed freedom's triumph over fascism's arrogance. If you found the story compelling, if it transported you to the frozen skies above Germany where the fate of nations hung in the balance, then subscribe to After the Last Shot. We bring history to life with cinematic narration, deep research, and stories that honor the sacrifice and courage of those who fought. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue to explore the untold moments that shaped the Second World War. This is history as it should be remembered, vivid, powerful, and unforgettable.